Dating is, well, for a start, highly speculative enterprise anyway, but also it's a gradation, it's a scale. Like, again, I could ask like what your parameter is, like how late could John's Gospel be, for example, to still consider it like canonical? And I think that would be a very difficult question to answer. I think it'd be an unfair one to ask. The dating itself is tricky. I mean, this is one of the things that
I think John's Gospel is first century for sure, 70 AD. I place it there,
so
but that's neither here nor there.
What makes you so sure about that?
I could pull up sources we've covered it on the channel in terms of people considering it dating earlier based on what is it the one of those manuscripts that was found to be
P52?
early first century. Was it P90? Was it P95? I don't know.
P90X.
P90X.
I think you're thinking you might be
I'm thinking about the workout.
P52 is
P52.
P52 is the
he hit me with the P90X workout back in the day. That was great.
Tony Horton.
Tony Horton, baby. P90. What is it? P55.
I think you're thinking of P52.
52. Yeah.
And
well, if it's early first century, if it's early second century, that means that the Gospel of John was already moving, and if it was moving, then it was likely written in the late first century.
Yeah, so we've come full circle. This is another thing that Wes Huff says in his podcast with Joe Rogan. Unfortunately, I do just think that is incorrect. P52 could be dated early, but like the scholarly consensus on this is also out, and we have to at least allow for a early 3rd century dating of the fragment of P52. And the John Rylands Library in Manchester.
Century. Wow. Okay.
Yes. And the John Rylands Library in Manchester, which holds P52, they say that the evidence is pointing towards a date closer to 200 AD. I think that's probably the safest bet. It's like around the 200 AD mark, right? Mm-hmm. Some people want to date it earlier. That's fine. Brent Nongbury is the person to talk to on this, and he wrote a paper in the Harvard Review of a theological review. I mentioned this in my video, called "The Use and Abuse of P52." Because people use it with this apologetical motive of trying to establish the early writing of John. There are so many problems with this. The first is that you just can't confidently date it that early. It can't be done.
Sure.
So
that's the argument. Others have dated it that early.
Yeah, Gavin's response to me said that, like, when I pointed out that like the dating of P52 is much broader than comfortably early 2nd century, let's say, which is I think what you'd need for this argument. He said, well, okay, well that allows for a later dating of John, but it doesn't mean that John's late. Well, of course it doesn't. I'm not going to say that John is late, but the idea that you can establish that John is in the 1st century because P52 was written early in the 2nd century and it had to travel around for enough time, like, if you allow for later dating of P52, then you cannot comfortably put John into the 1st century on those grounds. There might be other grounds, but P52 is not a very good one of them. That's why the paper is called "The Use and Abuse of P52." Most interesting about this to me is that, like, even if you take an early-ish dating for P52, like originally when it was found, it was thought to date between 100 and 150 AD. Like I say, the consensus is pushing that more towards like 200 now. Even if you take like 125 or something, like the distance between Ephesus, which is where John traditionally is said to have written his gospel, and the site where P52 like comes from is like not that far. Like, I mean, it's far in that it would like take you a few weeks as an ancient traveler to get there, but we're talking about like at an early dating of P52, given it 25 years to get there. And that's if it's early. Like it could be that it had over a century to travel to Egypt to then to then be discovered there. So like all of this, as I say, is speculative, and the consensus is I like Wes said it's comfortably 2nd century in the podcast. That was the quote. Like, again, that's not something that I'm going to like pick him up on its own sake. Like, okay, technically Brent Nongbury thinks that we should include like early 3rd century, dates as a possibility. But like, whatever, if he'd have just said, oh, P52 is really interesting, comfortably 2nd century, cool. But it's the fact that he then says that this can give us a 1st century dating of John, because it has to have been, he says, I think the phrases that he uses is, he says that P52 is comfortably early 2nd century. He says maybe even early 2nd century or something like this. And then he says, which means that at a minimum, we can comfortably push John back into the first century.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is assuming this early date of P52, but that assumption is like essentially an ungrounded one. At least, West might have his reasons, but he didn't present them there, and it's not in line with, I think, the academic consensus. So this dating of P52 business should not be used in the way that it is to give a first century dating of John.
Sure. Yeah, I would say I would need to see the academic consensus. I've seen both arguments across the spectrum: early dating, young dating. I mean, I think one can argue 1 Corinthians very early written, and they say that 1 Corinthians 15 creed goes back to within years of Jesus's resurrection. So I've heard that argument made. There's all types of arguments that can be made for this.
Something about what about the resurrection?
1 Corinthians 15. He shows up to the 500. He shows up to these people. He shows up to these people. That's written. Yeah. I want to say, what is it, 50?
Right, yeah. So this is really interesting. The idea
that creed that he's reciting to them goes back to the 30s.
Yes,
I've heard that.
Now, how does that creed end?
What do you mean? The creed ends with him with the resurrection claim.
How does that
end?
end?
Bodily resurrection, and some are still alive.
Well, he says, yeah, but where does he go? So he says, then they appear to Cephas, then they appear to the 12,
then the 500.
And last of all,
then
the 500, then last of all,
and then to me.
Then last of all, he appeared to me, right? So
yeah.
It's well known that at some point, if this is some early creed that he's reciting, at some point he breaks off from the creed, and is just talking from his own experience, because the creed would not include last of all, it appears to me.
Sure.
Maybe that's where he breaks off, but it's not entirely clear, right?
Okay.
So that is an interesting thing to talk about too, like whether that creed is an early sort of part of 1 Corinthians. But like, as I say, all of this is fascinating, and it kind of gets lost in I think a lot of the debate. But this dating of John to the first century is
you don't like
dubious.
It.
Let's not say wrong. It's just to say that, like, it's not. I don't think we can do it with so much confidence. Like, as I've pointed out, I think in the video I pointed this out. Like, there are scholars who are thinking that John is later. There are scholars who are thinking that Luke might be later than John now, because they think it might show some knowledge of the writings of Josephus and this kind of stuff. Like, there's all kinds of stuff like this going on all the time.
Sure.
We just don't know. The only thing that we can really be confident about is like the literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark. And the dating of Matthew and Luke are highly dependent on the dating of Mark in many ways. Except in their lower bound, because we use the destruction of the temple. But then if you're a Christian, maybe Jesus just did accurately predict it. So there's so much.
I have a massive update for you. I'm sure by this point, you've heard about the Blessed God Summit happening March 27th, 28th, 29th here in beautiful Carlsbad, California. But we've heard your requests. We've conceded to your demand. There are virtual tickets that are now available for the Blessed God Summit, so you can access it from anywhere in the world, as well as access to the replays. And for those of you guys that are looking for something extra, we're also offering a virtual ticket and an exclusive Bless God Summit merch bundle. There's some amazing art and some exclusive pieces done by our friend Josh Nadeau from Sword and Pencil that you have to check out. So join us online for the virtual event and experience some sessions from my favorite podcasters, pastors, and performers. We have a stacked lineup. I'm talking about Preston Perry, Dr. Sean McDowell, Inspiring Philosophy. What do you mean? Lila Rose, Alan Parr and his wife Jen Parr. We even have Nate Sala from Wise Disciple, Gavin Ortland, David Wood, Avery from God Logic Apologetics. And on the pastoral side, we have my friend Daniel Golding, Pastor Ed Newton from CBC in San Antonio, and my personal pastor from Rhythm Church, Pastor Jeff Moores and his wife Erin Moores. You won't want to miss out from amazing performances from America's Got Talent winner Dustin Savella, Billboard charting hip-hop artist John Keith and Miles Minnick, and as seen on Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God tour, Dirt Poor Robbins. And we're still finalizing a few more speakers. So head over to blessgod.shop, get your virtual ticket now, and you can get yourself a bundle with some of the exclusive merch as well. I'll see you over there, all right? Peace.
Yeah. Going on here.
Well, yeah, because if you're presupposing that he can't, if you're presupposing he can, then you got to date it later. But if you're presupposing he can, then you have no problem with it being early.
Yeah. Exactly. So if Westhuff says, look, P52, I think it's probably mid-second century, maybe even early second century. And if that's the case, then given how much time it would take to move around, I think we've got a pretty good indication that John might be first century. Fine. Mm-hmm. But if you say that P52 is comfortably second century, and therefore at a minimum and comfortably we can push John into the first century, I just think that this is, again, misleading as to what the scholarly consensus actually is. And what it's going to make people believe is that, the Isaiah scroll is word for word identical, and John is super early, and we can know it with confidence.
We came full
the
circle.
Gospel of Peter, by the way, he does the opposite thing. He does the opposite thing with the Gospel of Peter, the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, which in the podcast he dates between the 2nd and the 4th century, which is like a radically late dating for Peter. Like who thinks it was who thinks it was written in the 4th century? Like can you name a scholar who believes that? I'm sure somebody can, but like it's not very popularly believed. And so it's like there is something a bit unfortunate about the way that when it comes to John or the Isaiah scroll, we're going with the most charitable like understanding of their dating and whatnot. But when it comes to something like the Gospel of Peter, it's the least charitable possible, like dating that would be scholarly, taken scholarly seriously. I think that's kind of interesting. The stuff about Paul as well, I don't think that's been sufficiently addressed in many ways, like by some of the responses about the whole 500 thing. I think that's really interesting about how we don't know who these people are. It's the only time it shows up, and there is an indication that Paul might have been talking about a vision in the sky. There's like so much interesting stuff here. And
there's a lot
the most
of interesting stuff
unfortunate thing about it is that that's getting lost.
Yeah, I guess what I come back to is there's all sorts of interesting stuff, and that I don't. Yeah, when you say comfortably, I don't like the word comfortably. I don't like this word. Like that's where I'm like, okay, Alex. Like it does seem that we're going back to the full circle moment of the conversation, and even West is like, the point of that wasn't an apologetic for it. I think he had a different idea with that, which again he'll address with you whenever he gets around to it.
This is really important though, because of course, like with John's gospel, let's say, like if we're disputing whether John was written in 90 AD or 120 AD, that's like the difference between whether the eyewitnesses are still alive or not. That's a big deal. Like the difference between 150 and 170 might not be a big deal, but like when you're talking around that kind of time, it makes all the difference as to whether this could have been written by John the son of Zebedee, which I don't think scholars tend to believe, but that's how tradition has identified it. And certainly whether it's written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses is heavily dependent on these few decades of dating around the turn of the 2nd century. Yeah. And if you're going to rely on P52 to do that, like you're on very fragmented grounding, if you like.
Fair enough. And I'm pretty. West was not using P52 as an apologetic argument. He was using it as a story. In terms
as an apologetic for the early dating of John, though, right? Like he was using it as an apologetic for the early dating.
I don't even think I think he was primarily speaking to it being a facsimile, right? In terms of the way he was presenting it to Joe Rogan.
Well, he had this facsimile that he gave to Joe, which was kind of a cute moment. Like that's a cool thing to do. But
I'm sure he can make one for you, Alex.
He brought. I would love one, especially made by West Huff. If he could sign it, that'd be cool. There's
I'll
one
pay for it.
In Hebrew.
Like he brings it up later. Yeah, let's do it in Coptic or something.
Of the Isaiah scroll, of the missing verses from Isaiah that you're upset about.
Here they are. I sent them in the post because you said you were missing these. I think that he does bring it up later though, like separate from the. Although I think he presents the facsimile and then maybe talks about it afterwards. But he's just talking about the dating of John, and he says that we can comfortably date John in the 1st century because of P52. I don't think that's true. That's something that I just don't think is true. And of course, you're probably not gonna want to talk about this in too much depth because this has sort of come up out of nowhere, and you'll want to check your sources, speak to scholars and stuff. But like I mean it when I say like that's also a big deal. It's not nitpicking. It's whether the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, which, as you remember, is one of the main apologetical tools generally that Wes used, like to Joe Rogan when explaining the Gospels.
Yes, depending on when you date the Gospels, and there's early datings and old datings, and there's debate amongst it, and what presuppositions were coming in.
And did you see in my video? What did you think of the idea? I don't know if you watched the video in its entirety, but near the end, I discuss ideas such as the idea that John chapter 21 is a later addition to the Gospel of John. That's a really interesting idea as well.
Which video is this?
In the Wes Huff video, in the original Wes Huff video.
I'd have to go back and see that video.
At the end, you
talk about John being 21 being added later.
That's right.
Okay, and this is in the manuscript.
This is no. We don't have any manuscript evidence for this. This is why it's different from something like the short ending of Mark, where if you read the long version of Mark, you might not think that there's anything weird about it. But if you look at the manuscripts, it's clearly missing. With John 21, it's the opposite. We don't have any early manuscripts, but the earliest manuscripts that we have of complete John will be Codex Vaticanus, I think, or maybe what's the other one? Sinaiticus, right? And those are like 3rd century. So we actually don't have any like super early manuscripts of John in total at all. So manuscript evidence, no. But what we do have is John 21. It's so interesting, man. So like John 20, remember how it ends? Where Jesus basically, it says like...
well, John 21 is like an epilogue, right? John 21 is
yeah,
like
but this is the thing. It's got this like epilogue vibe, but like why? So like John chapter 20, I think the ending is something like, and these things are written so that you may also believe, like that's sort of how it's written. So it's like Jesus did many other things, and these things are written so that you may believe. And my friend said to me that when he was reading through the Gospels, he got to that point and thought it was the end. And then he turned the page and was like, oh, it carries on. Okay, that's a bit weird, but like, okay, fair enough. So what happens? Well, in John chapter 20, Jesus has just commissioned his disciples and sent them out and said, go, like you can forgive people's sins. If you forgive their sins are forgiven. Like spread the word. Like he sends them out with this mission. They've met the resurrected Christ. And then you turn the page and they're fishing in Galilee. They've just like gone back to business as usual, as if like nothing has happened, which is kind of strange. Not only this, but this is the first time in John's gospel that the disciples are called fishermen. The rest of John's gospel doesn't seem to know that they're fishermen, but John chapter 21 does. John 21 also has, I think, 28 unique Greek terms that aren't found elsewhere in John chapter 20. Some of them are subject specific, like the word breakfast. Like that makes sense that it's only in John 21. But other ones, like the verb to turn, which there are different ways of saying. The way of saying it in John 21 is a word that doesn't show up anywhere else in John's gospel. Where that word does show up is in the synoptics. You also have Jesus walking across the water and the miraculous catching of fish, which is a miracle that has already occurred in the synoptic gospels, but isn't in John until the very end. So there is this idea that John 21 has been written at a later point by somebody else, or maybe the same author at a later time, who knew about the synoptic gospels, because it's using Greek terms that are in the synoptics, miracles that are in the synoptics. It's showing knowledge of them as fishermen, which is something that we get from the synoptics. And this is really interesting because you ask, well, what happens in John 21? Jesus reinstates Peter. He sort of basically forgives Peter, who's not treated very kindly in John's gospel until you get to John chapter 21. And suddenly it's like, actually, Peter, you're all cool and you're going to be the leader of the church. And in fact, like Peter even turns around to the beloved disciple and says, what about that guy? Why would he be saying that in that context? Well, what about this guy? And Jesus is like, what's it to you? Who cares about this guy? So the idea is that this has been written as a polemic in early Christianity in favor of Petrine leadership of the church. You can imagine like a sort of early power struggle in the church. Peter becomes the leader and some people aren't very happy about that. And John's gospel, the Johannites, these guys don't like Peter. They think that maybe the beloved disciple should have been the leader of the church, or somebody else should have been the leader of the church. Yeah. And so this chapter is added to reinstate Peter's reputation in Scripture. Now, that is a really interesting theory. It's a really interesting idea. We don't know the Catholics. We don't have any manuscript.
The Catholics would like that.
But I think it is absolutely fascinating.
I think the Catholics would be very upset at you for this theory of them not liking.
Evan Powell's the unfinished gospel is the book to read on that point. He comes to some pretty extraordinary conclusions, but it's like I think it's an entertaining book to read. I'd recommend it for those.
I'm entertained by how entertained you are by all this stuff, Alex. I'll be honest with you. I think John, the ending of John, it seems to be intentional. Maybe it's not. Maybe it was added by John afterwards. Who knows? I think the general consensus I take away from all of this is that I think there are certain claims that we agree on with regards to the mystery of whatever they were convinced of seeing a bodily risen Jesus. It sounds like you're more open to the idea that it was a mass hallucination event. I'm convinced that he bodily rose from the grave as he predicted he would, and that the scriptures are generally reliable and generally have a historic account of who Jesus is. This is kind of Bart Ehrman's entire point. I'm sure you've seen his debate with Jimmy Akin. And I think from there, people have to... Yeah, you should watch it. I think you'll actually really like it. I think from there, there's this consensus on Jesus was a historical figure. Jesus was really crucified. All the arguments you've made, and we have to figure out what are we going to do with the resurrection account. It sounds like you're going to default to, hey, I think it was a mass hallucination, or that's the most logical explanation to me. I'm going to say, based on the arguments and the application and transformation in my own life of what Jesus has done for me, I'm going to stick to the idea that Jesus really is who he claimed to be. He predicted his death, he died, and he rose, and he's added the most amount of good to society as a whole. And I think where therein lies, like, you know, we can talk about all these fascinating things, which I'm genuinely fascinated that you're fascinated by all this stuff. Like, I think it's very interesting. Yeah. But I ultimately
the reason it matters. Yeah.
Right. Now, I was just gonna say, ultimately, I think like people want you to come to a saving faith, Alex. Like, I think that's our heart in having these conversations with you. Even though you're not as non-combative, you are non-resistant, and we're gonna we're praying and hoping that, you know, that the Holy Spirit gets a hold of your heart, bro. And I think that's the because this stuff can get in the weeds, and a lot of this stuff is beyond anywhere near my area of expertise. You're way smarter than I am in some of this, but I do think, like, ultimately, what do we do with that mystery of the resurrection, and what do we do with the teachings of Jesus, and how do we interact with them? Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Please be sure to comment below and subscribe and all that good stuff, and check out this other video that YouTube seems to be recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.